Today, we'll be looking at the role of both genetics and environment and how each of those things together shape a person. First, what is genetics? Before we get into the details, there are a few basic terms that I'd like you to know. First, DNA. That's short for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is, as many of you already know, the hereditary material that is used by most species and is comprised of nucleotides, or building blocks. And genes are the fundamental units of biological information, and they are made of DNA. Typically, a gene will be on the order of a couple hundreds or even a few thousand DNA nucleotides long. Genetics is the study of genes, genetic variation, and heredity in living organisms. It's basically the study of codes bound inside every cell of the human body, which affects virtually everything about a person. Finally, an allele is a term that comes up a lot when scientists talk about gene-by-environment interactions, and it refers to any variants of a gene that takes more than one form. So it's basically a gene variant, which is typically in the form of short or long and varies across individuals. We will talk more about this later. Now let's get into the main part of our lesson, which is gene-by-environment interactions. Let's first take a look at a debate about nature versus nurture, and get straight to this point. I love it when people ask me as a geneticist, where are you on the nature versus nurture controversy? Well, let me tell you, I found that this question is actually just kind of silly. There's no controversy. It's nearly always somewhat of both. Because the reality is, pretty much any trait, not all, but pretty much any trait that you look at has contributions from both genetics and environment. It's as simple as that. In other words, it's not a pure dichotomy. It's rarely a either-or. It's some of both. However, one may contribute way more than the other. So for example, eye color. There might be a small environmental component to that, like very small. But there is a very strong genetic component to eye color. Like I could lie out in the sun and stare out into the sun forever, but my eyes are not going to turn blue. Similarly, HIV status. Yes, there are some genes which are slightly predisposed to being less likely to getting infected with HIV. But there's obviously a huge environmental component where your behavior and lifestyle is going to affect how likely you are of getting infected with HIV. Next, let's take a look at the extent to which both genetics and environment matter using twins as an example. There are two types of twins: monozygotic twins, which are identical twins and are genetically exactly the same. And then dizygotic, or fraternal twins, which are genetically no different from any other brothers or sisters. And we predict that if there is a genetic component to some trait, for example, height, then monozygotic twins should be more similar than dizygotic twins if each pair are given the same environment or raised in the same household. One study after another, we tend to see this consistent difference between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. For example, for IQ, or intelligence coefficient, monozygotic twins tend to score very similarly on these tests, with a high correlation of 0.85. And dizygotic twins, less similarly, with a correlation of 0.42, which is slightly on the lower side. So you can see that there is a genetic component to what is measured here as IQ. Same is true for some diseases. If you look at gastroesophageal reflux disease, you see monozygotic twins have slightly higher correlation than dizygotic twins. So we can say that there is the presence of a genetic component, but it's important to know that this does not indicate absence of environmental component. But what if we take a look at monozygotic twins that are reared apart rather than sharing a similar environment? How would they compare in terms of traits and risks for various diseases compared to monozygotic twins reared together. Any predictions here? Well, let's take a look at the data here. These numbers here suggest that for certain traits like BMI, or body mass index, monozygotic twins reared together and apart are not too different from one another, even if they grew up on opposite sides of the world under completely different circumstances. Monozygotic twins tend to have very similar BMI. This suggests that there might be a little bit of an environmental component, but it is surprisingly very small. But in contrast, when it comes to verbal ability, there is a sizable difference between monozygotic twins reared together versus reared apart, which suggests a very strong environmental component. At the same time, this verbal ability example also shows a strong genetic component because monozygotic twins reared together tend to be way more similar than dizygotic twins reared together. Clearly, both genetics and environment play important roles on people's traits and outcomes. But as you can see, for some traits, one matters more than the other. Now let's switch gears a little bit and take a look at some behavioral genes. We're going to look at some key behavioral genes that affect either the brain development or the processing of the brain's chemical messengers. These genes are primarily looked at because of their links to various mood, psychiatric, or personality disorders. Let's take a look at a question that comes up often in behavioral sciences. Why are some individuals more likely to engage in behaviors that are self-destructive and antisocial than others? There's been a lot of research conducted in this field so far, basically all trying to answer this very question. And this is what we will call science of yesterday. This is the way we used to look at the link between genetics and psychopathology until new evidence emerged very recently. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. It's just a way of thinking that dominated the field at the time. What brought this on was the idea, which was probably one of the most influential ideas in psychiatric and personality research like ever, that certain variants of key behavioral genes can make some people more vulnerable than others in certain mood, psychiatric, or personality disorders, including depression, anxiety, ADHD, heightened risk-taking, and antisocial, sociopathic, or violent behaviors. We call this the vulnerability hypothesis, or others call this the stress diathesis model of psychopathology. It basically says that some people are at a heightened risk because of a genetic variant that they carry. Genetic variant, if you remember from the beginning part of this lecture, is also referred to as alleles. The 5-HTT-LPR gene is a notorious one often studied in this line of research. And the S allele of this gene, the other variant is the AL allele, is the risk allele that has been found to be associated with increased depression, particularly if the person is living in a high-stress context. In other words, if you have this S version of the gene, then you are more likely to suffer from depression and other psychiatric or personality disorders. Although this vulnerability hypothesis was revolutionary and really was able to explain so much of what is going wrong with some individuals, what was causing their behavioral, psychological problems? One thing it could not explain was the exact opposite of that. How do some individuals grow up to be society's most creative, successful, and happy people? This brings us to the science of today, also known as the plasticity genes or sensitivity hypothesis. This is a new radical hypothesis just starting to emerge in this field. And according to this hypothesis, risky genes that some individuals carry that was found to be associated with higher psychological behavioral problems, it can actually serve in beneficial ways. In other words, risk can become possibility, or vulnerability becomes plasticity. It's sort of like two sides of the same coin, but with dramatically different effects depending on environmental context.